Good afternoon or good morning, depending on when you're listening to this. I'm Richard Burton. I'm going to be chatting with you today, at least unilaterally, about incompatible activities, conflicts of interest, and violations of the contract code. So, we're going to talk about a lot of do's and don'ts, mostly don'ts, and I will be referring to a number of different forms that are available that you should have in your possession, but if you don't, you could always get them on the department's intranet site. And the first one that you should have with you, which I'll be talking about a lot, is PUB 228. That's the departmental incompatible activity statement. And also PS 413. That's the Incompatible Activities Certification. And we'll talk about that as well. And there's some other things form-wise that we'll talk about that you probably will have as well. But these are the main ones. So with that said, we're going to go window by window and we'll have a discussion about the different subjects that are appearing on your window. So we're going to move forward to the first one, which will be some of the topics that we talked about. Now you look at these topics and you might say, well, what's the difference between a conflict of interest and an incompatible activity? Well, sometimes they sort of run hand in hand. If you're doing something that conflicts with your job, it may also be an incompatible activity. So we're going to get into those subjects so you can see what I'm talking about. And then lastly, we'll handle the public contracts code stuff. But I will say that as a community care licensing employee, very rare that we would have an employee that would need to worry too much about the public contracts code, because most of the time employees are not involved in public contracts where they might get some sort of a benefit. So we'll move on to the next window. Now, Government Code 19990, that's the operative code that deals with incompatible activities and outside employment, and it's also mentioned on the basis of the departmental incompatible activity statement, which is PUB 228. And if you look at PUB 228, you'll see on page 1 and page 2 some important information about this window that we're looking at, especially the definitions. So if we look at page 2 of PUB 228, you're going to see in bold definitions, and we're going to be talking very shortly about some of those. And essentially, the government code and our own DSS policy talks about what it is that we're not supposed to do. And as a state employee, you're not supposed to engage in employment activities or enterprises which are clearly inconsistent, incompatible, or in conflict, or inimical, which means identical, to your duties as a state employee or officer. And this even includes volunteer activities. And each appointing authority is obligated, every state agency, in other words, is obligated to make sure their employees are not engaging in these possible incompatible activities. And some of you might be wondering, well, why is this an issue? Well, unfortunately, going back way years ago, there were some bad apples that ruined it for everybody, basically. And now the state must be very careful about the outside activities that its employees engage in to make sure that they don't conflict with or are inconsistent with their duties with the state. So here we see a lot of verbiage about some of the things that are definitely a no-no. But before we get into those, let's look at page 2 of PUB 228. And now I want you to focus on the last couple of definitions there where it talks about, quote, outside employment and, quote, outside activity. And let's talk about outside activity first, because we're going to be talking a lot about this. And I always get a lot of questions about this. And the definition is pretty clear. It's not confusing. And it is an outside, it could be an outside employment, enterprise, or service. And I want you to remember the word service. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, it says outside activity could be employment, but right above that it says outside employment. So that's kind of confusing. Well, two different things here. If we look above and we see outside employment, that means it's defined as a partnership, ownership, or services performed by a departmental employee on his own time, hopefully, or it could happen during working hours. And he or she, this is important, may not get any money for it, but it's still employment under this definition. This includes business employment of spouses too, registered domestic partners, which the employee would have a financial interest in by operation of law. For example, your spouse owns a daycare, and you think to yourself, well, I don't have to say anything about it because that's my spouse's business and I don't work there. I work for the state. I come to work and I don't have anything to do with his daycare. Well, according to our definition here, that is an employment of your spouse that you get have a financial interest in because you live in the same home. It's community property, and of course you're getting some financial interest out of your husband's or your spouse's business. So the department always wants to know about your outside interests and your spouse's to make sure there's no incompatibility. Of course, the department would be very interested to find out if your spouse owned a care facility because the department would want to make sure, as an LPA, if that's what you do for CCL, that you have nothing to do with that facility. That would be a slight conflict if you did. But now let's go back to the outside activity part. Very similar to outside employment. And I remember a few moments ago I said make sure and keep in mind the service part of this because this is definitely going to come up. I get tons of questions about this. And it's mostly because people don't like the definition, and that's why they want to ask questions about it because they'd rather it didn't mean what it did. It's somewhat of what I would call an inconvenient fact, to pull something from Al Gore. An outside activity is an employment, enterprise, or a service. So if you're performing a service for somebody else, even if you're not getting one single penny, not one dime, it's still an outside activity. For example, if you work at a homeless shelter twice a year giving out free food to the homeless, that's a service that you're performing for somebody else, and that is an outside activity. That doesn't mean that it's going to be forbidden. It would for sure be approved, but it is an outside activity. And what would not be an outside activity would be, for example, that you are in a hiking group and you belong to the group. Maybe it's the Sierra Club and you go on hikes. In that situation, you're not performing a service for someone. You're simply enjoying other people's company and having fun. Now, if you actually ran the hiking group and each person had to pay $50 to be in the group and you get to pocket the money, now we're talking about something different. That would be an employment that's outside of work because you're getting money. But if you're just in some sort of a bowling group or a hiking group or something fun like that, a roller skating group, or you go on a fun run for a marathon, none of those are considered a service performed. A service performed is when you are doing something for someone else, and again, I know this sounds like a broken record, you don't have to be paid. So, now that we've gotten some of these definitions out of the way, I hope, we're going to be able to kind of go through some of these. Now, if we look at page 1 of the PUB 228, the Incompatible Activity Statement, let's go to the part where it says penalty for violating the Incompatible Activities Policy. Of course, that's always on everybody's mind. Can I get in trouble for this? Well, yes. An employee may be subject to discipline for violating Government Code 19990, and it really would be the same thing as violating PUB 228 because they're both based on the same government code. And the severity of the action might depend on all the circumstances of the activity. For example, let's say we had an LPA who was taking money from licensees to look the other way when they saw potential serious violations. For example, somebody died and they were laying in the garden and the LPA was receiving $100,000 a year from the licensee, and the LPA said, I never saw the guy laying in the garden. Okay, that LPA would be fired, because here you're taking money from a licensee that directly violates Government Code 1999. It's an incompatible activity. You are getting something for your looking the other way. Great example of when it is the case that you could possibly get fired for your outside activities, which occurred during work or outside of work. In this case, it occurred during work. So if we're looking, now we're looking at our slide here, our window, where it says incompatible activities continued. Some of the things that you're not to do: receiving or accepting indirectly any gift, money, gratuity, like going to see the Los Angeles Lakers, somebody gives you tickets, like a licensee. Oh, I had a couple of extra tickets. I thought you might like them. I can't go. Would you like to go? Do not take those tickets. Same thing with entertainment. Licensee tries to give you a card for Applebee's that they got from someone else. They just want to pass it along to be nice. Don't take that. Loans. Let's say you walk into a facility and you're asked by the licensee, how are you today? And the LPA says, I'm broke. I'm having a really hard time in life. Oh, I know someone that could help you with a loan. Don't do it. That would be an incompatible activity. Accepting anything from value from someone that you're doing business with. You're engaging in your duties. You don't get to take things of value from licensees, for example, or licensees' employees, because it will almost always be looked at as a gift intended to influence you in your official capacity. I know some of you are thinking, well, what about a glass of water if it's really hot out? Well, those things do happen. It's always best to try to avoid those situations by bringing your own water for a lot of reasons. But, you know, it's one thing to be offered a glass of water versus another getting a big, huge jar of Maui water that you know costs a lot of money. And in that situation, I would tell you, don't take that water, because that could be looked at as a gift. Some of this gets to be ridiculous, but in my opinion, it's always better to not take anything from a licensee, because the minute you do and you cite the licensee a month later, then your manager gets a phone call and the licensee is going to say that you coerced them into giving you that cup of water and coerced them into using their bathroom, and that you didn't want to do that, but the LPA made you do that by insinuating that you'd get lots of citations if you didn't. Now, as the LPA, of course, you're thinking to yourself, this is unbelievable. I never solicited, and I didn't pressure anybody to give me anything. And that person is lying. Well, that's what happens, and that's why it's best never to accept those kind of gifts. You're just asking for trouble. So we're looking at our next window here. Having access to confidential information by virtue of your state employee. We talked about receiving money in consideration for the performance of your duties. So we're going to talk a little bit about the use of confidential information. Sometimes this comes up, and the information, somebody might say, is not necessarily confidential, but you're using your state resources to get it. And how this comes up, let's say one of your friends tells you that they are on Match.com. And they're dating someone who claims they own a lot of care facilities. And could you check this out to see if the person's lying? Because I want to find out if he's really got any money or not. You say, okay. So you go into FAST and you look this guy up. That would be using or having access to confidential info by way of your employment for the advantage of somebody else. It says, for private gain or advantage, or providing confidential info to a person whose issuance of this information has not been authorized. That's a great example. Or you have a friend who owns a care facility who got cited, or a relative, and they're telling you how unfair it was, this citation. It's much too severe from what they've heard in the community from other licensees. And can you please go in and check to see what other facilities usually get for this types of violation? Sure, I will. So you go into FAST and you start digging around. Should you do that? Heck no. This directly tells you do not do that. You're accessing info by way of your job for somebody else's advantage. That's confidential info. Now somebody might say, well, Mr. Burton, FAST is not confidential. That's information open to the public. Well, au contraire, this is information that you're gaining from your workplace computer that is not accessible necessarily to the public. So if you engage in that type of behavior with the idea that this is info that's not confidential, you do so at your own risk. And eventually, you may end up getting disciplined if you're caught. So never go into FAST or access files that are not yours, cases that are not yours for some unauthorized purpose. The only time you should be FAST or looking at licensee cases, even in the filing cabinet, if they relate to something you are working on, not what somebody else is working on or dealing with. This is not to say if somebody else in the office needed some help and they asked you to go look at a facility file to see if there was any violations because they couldn't make it that day and they're asking you to do it for them. That's okay. It's just that when your friends and family are asking you to look at confidential stuff, that's kind of a no-no. And that violates PUB 228 in a number of different ways. And we will, if we get in PUB 228 and you look at page, starting with page 4, where it says misuse of position and or resources. And this is very important. We're going to talk a lot about this. Misuse of position and or resources including state time, facilities, that means state stuff inside a state building, equipment or supplies for private gain and or for the advantage of another person. That definition is something that you really need to keep in mind because you don't get to use state stuff for yourself or someone else unless it relates to your work. Each departmental employee is expected to devote his or her full time to your work. That doesn't mean spending half a day chatting on your cell phone to your friends and family and or boyfriend or girlfriend or husband and wife. That is a misuse of state time. You might say, well, it's my own private cell phone. What's the big deal? Well, you're misusing your state time. You're getting paid 8 hours and 4 of it you spent chit-chatting on your phone. And believe me, your employee, your coworkers that especially don't like you are going to tell on you. So, state time, misusing that. Misusing the state computer, misusing the state emails to be on Match.com. I love that example because it happens all the time where people are getting emails back and they have State of California Department of Social Services and the date goes bad, something happens, next thing you know the employee, the non-employee is calling in and complaining saying, your employee sent me emails on Match.com on the state computer and I want to file a complaint. Not good. You don't want to do that. So you're using anything that you use for other than a state purpose, including your state cell phone, calling all over the place out of state, when calling porn lines, calling shopping networks, making appointments at the nail salon, all that stuff is a no-no. Now that's not to say that you can't have what's called incidental use. You have to call home. That's okay. But you know, there is judgment that needs to be involved when you're misusing state equipment, email, the computer system, the copy machine, the fax machine, and the cell phone for your own purposes. You're not supposed to, and that's what PUB 228 talks about. That's what this window is talking about. So I would very carefully review page 4, 5, and 6. Gives you great examples of all of the things that you're not supposed to do. And we're going to again go back over some of these things. We're continuing on here with the next window, and it says continue. Performance of an act, and other than his or her capacity as a state employee, knowing that the act may may later be subject directly or indirectly to control, inspection, review, audit, or enforcement. And then the next window, next paragraph there, subject to other rules or regulations, not devoting his full-time attention to state employee during. So you're thinking, what does all this mean? So there's lots of examples that could be had regarding this where let's say you're inspecting a care facility, or you're auditing a care facility, or you're supposed to enforce the laws, and at the same time, you're taking money from the care facility. This is a great example of engaging in an activity that's directly and complex. It's a performance of an act other than in your capacity of employee that relates to your work. And that's a great example of it. Getting money to make sure an applicant to run a care facility gets it done quickly. Here's $500. Can't do that. But it happens, believe it or not. And we've already talked a little bit about making sure that you're devoting your full time and efforts to your work. And we'll talk a lot more about that as we move along here. So when we talk about what you can and cannot do outside of work, remember we talked a little bit earlier when we were talking about definitions, and I said that somebody might say, well, is working at a homeless shelter giving away free food, is that considered a service, and is that an outside activity? Yes, it is. But remember I said to you that that doesn't mean that it won't be allowed. There's a lot of outside activities that are okay to do, but there's a lot that are ones that you cannot do. And here we're looking at a section of PUB 228, and I want you to turn to PUB 228, and that would be on page 3. And we're in the section of the shall nots versus the ones that, actually we're in the prohibited zone now, I believe. Let's take a look. Oh, no, we're in the shall nots. I'm sorry. So that would be on the top of page 3. So this is especially true when you're thinking about as an LPA or even as an OT or a person working in CCL dealing with enforcement things. And we're looking at this and we're asking ourselves, can I open up a care facility? Can I do foster care? Can I do daycare? No, you cannot, because that's in direct conflict with what you do for the state. Those would be things that would never be approved. And if we look at the definition on the top of PUB 228, an employee shall not engage in outside employment that's directly or indirectly related to their work. Indirectly or directly related to their review, control, inspection, or audit of that employee. Here are some examples, and now we're looking at some of those. So if you're an LPA and we're looking at our definition, is this related to your functions? Are these activities related to your inspection? Yes, they are. If you were to open a counseling or a group care home or a foster care or a daycare, medical examinations are used. No, you're not a doctor. But if you were, that might not be something that you could do. It just depends. Involvement in a lawsuit against the department. So there's other examples. So the process here is if you wanted to engage in one of these activities, you would have to request it. And we'll talk later about the request process, but if you look at PS 413, that form that you should have, this would be the form that you would fill out to request to engage in some of these activities. Now, I will give you a great example of activities that are commonly requested for LPAs. I know I'm picking on LPAs a lot today. And we're looking at our window here, and we see real estate. Probably a lot of you are saying, well, I know an LPA that's a real estate agent, and she drives a Mercedes. And I think that that's just not appropriate. Now, maybe there's certain parts of that may not be appropriate. We'll talk about that. But if an LPA wants to sell real estate, they can do that. They would have to fill out this form. They would turn it in to personnel with their duty statement, and it would go through a legal process. Now, if we look at, again, we're moving back to our PUB 228 form, it explains how to ask for these things, and that's on page 7 and 8 of the form. So you would fill this out, you would turn it in, and it would go to the legal division for a review, and legal division would either say yes or no to this. and then it would go to the deputy director, and ultimately you would get a decision. And there are many LPAs that are real estate agents. Now, here's where things can go haywire for somebody that is an LPA, for example, that's a real estate agent. Remember when we talked about some of the misuses of state time that we talked about on page 4 of PUB 228? I mentioned misuse of position or resources, including using state time, facilities, equipment, or supplies for private gain. An activity pursued during working hours or outside that impedes an employee's ability to comply with this obligation is incompatible. Now, if we look at page 5 of that, there's all kinds of examples. Don't use the copy machine for personal stuff. No employee shall take or convert to his own use any products, like paper, for example. No employee shall arrange for employment outside of state service while at work. No employee shall use its badge and symbol, vehicle, training material, equipment for private use. So you're asking yourself, what's this have to do with an LPA being a real estate agent going haywire? Well, here's how it happened. LPA gets approval to be a real estate agent and is overheard half of the day by coworkers on their state cell phone talking to their client about why they have not gotten a loan approved yet. And their coworkers are hearing this. And guess what? They're going to go and they're going to rat to management that you, the employee, are spending state time on your state cell phone making real estate deals. That directly violates the parameters of PUB 228 because you're misusing state time and you're misusing the state cell phone. And keep in mind that the state of California has every right to request the phone call records of your workplace cell phone, request the records of phone calls on your state phone that's at your desk, has the right to do a hard drive analysis of your state authorized laptop, has the right to do a hard drive analysis of your desktop computer, and a complete email pull of all your sent, all your received, your delete. And if you think you're going to be sneaky and hit the delete, that won't work. We can get access to that as well. Each state employee has no expectation of privacy under the law to state equipment because it's not yours. So when an LPA has been approved to be a real estate agent, not only are they making deals sometimes in their cubicle, but they're also doing it in the care facility. Walking through the facility on their cell phone, talking about listings, talking about the mortgage loan, talking about the tax records that are needed, etc. And the licensee overhears this. Guess who's going to make a phone call to management the minute they get cited, or if they just hate you in general, the licensee, and they're going to complain. Then the department is going to be obligated to complete an investigation and take a look at your cell phone records and take a look at your other emails and anything else that the department might deem curious about. And if you think that you'll be on your private cell phone during this time and therefore the department won't be able to investigate anything, that's not true, because if the department believes the licensee that you've engaged in this behavior and there's coworkers that overheard you engaged in this behavior at work on your private cell phone, the department can take action and investigate it further, ask you questions, and of course you'll have to be truthful about it. So again, you could get approved for certain activities, and if you do, don't do them while you're at work. And the other part about this that we talked about is when you are at work, and we talked about soliciting business. And we're looking at our PUB 228, and it's no employee shall solicit business while they're at work. And you'll see this in the middle of the prohibition on page 5, I believe it is. And that would be if you're at a facility and you're a real estate agent and you're just happen to be talking to the licensee about the fact that you're a real estate agent, and I don't know how it came up, but the licensee says, oh, my daughter's looking for a house. Can you help her? No, you cannot. Do not do it. You do not get to solicit, nor do you get to engage in any business relationships with the licensee, nor the licensee's employees. And that also includes social functions. We'll talk about that a little bit, but if you're there at a licensee to inspect it, and somebody mentions that someone's having a baby shower, you don't go to the licensee's baby shower for their daughter. And they better not be invited to your daughter's baby shower or wedding shower or bachelorette party or any social function. I know there's some of you that are saying, well, what happens when I'm at Applebee's and I happen to see a licensee or their employee? I didn't invite them there. They just happened to be there. Well, those things happen, but you do not want to get in any over-familiar relationships with people that you have to do business with on behalf of the state, where you're auditing or you're inspecting. So we're going to now go to the next window in a moment, but there's a few things that I will tell you that come up here and there once in a while, and that's foster care and foster adopt. Lots of you might be asking yourself whether or not that's okay, and management carefully considers those requests. Often, if it's a foster adopt issue where somebody is genuinely considering adopting versus just fostering to make money, sometimes those are approved. But if it's the belief or the idea that you can make money whether you're an OT or in some other position, not an LPA, by fostering a child, most likely that would be disapproved because of conflicts with what we do here in CCL or what you would do in CCL. So we've already talked about some of these basic rules. We've talked about the gifts a little bit, like not taking nice big glasses of fancy water or food from facilities, sees candy. The list is endless, the stuff that gets offered to LPAs, and these are all considered gifts, so you don't want to take them. And we talked a little bit about volunteering being an independent contractor does not make an incompatible activity permissible. So let's move on to the next window. Economic interests. We've talked a little bit about gifts and loans. Now travel is an interesting one. Obviously, if you're an LPA, for example, you're not going to go traveling around with a licensee, and you certainly better not take a free ticket to Lake Tahoe for the weekend that the licensee got for free and just wanted to pass it forward. You would not want to do that. Or accept money to go on a travel or on a trip from a licensee. Those things happen. Very likely you will be disciplined and you will no longer be working at the agency. It's a gross conflict. Can't do it. Real property. You're wondering, well, what's that? What's that about? Well, let's say you owned a second home. Can you rent it to a care facility that was in your caseload or is within your caseload? No, that's a direct conflict. Can't do that. Now, if you're in adult care and you're renting a facility to some child care, you might ask, well, can I do that? Well, those would be carefully considered, and if it was allowed, you would be given a firewall by management of what you would be allowed to do. You wouldn't be able to go there. You wouldn't be able to give advice. You couldn't consult, etc. So sometimes things would be allowable depending on the circumstances and the conditions that would be provided. So you want to look at some of the arrows here about possible conflicts, and you have to ask yourself, common sense, is this kosher? Does it comport with these rules about misuse of my position, and is it directly related to my duties? Does it have anything to do with my work? Most of the time the answer, unfortunately, is going to be yes. So here's some hypotheticals. An LPA working for you has volunteered to write home studies for a nonprofit adoption agency, which is licensed by the office. First of all, is this an outside activity? Absolutely. Would it be approved? Likely no, because this is, as a licensee, they're writing studies for an agency licensed by the office. That's a direct conflict in that you're engaging in outside activities that relate to your work. Now, how about this next one? You're going to want to teach a class at JC relating to the department's processes. That is an outside activity, and no, it would likely not be approved because your duties here would be in conflict with you providing college classes on how to comply with departmental rules. That directly goes to the heart of the incompatible activities, where we talk about an outside activity that's directly or indirectly related to your functions and responsibilities here or subject to your review and control. Now, here's an interesting one. You notice an employee is always showing up late to work and exhausted. You learn that she's got a second job. You hear rumors that she drives up in a Mercedes. What should you do about that? Should you tell management, hey, I think employee B has another job? Well, that's up to you. You're not necessarily obligated to tell management whenever you think somebody might be engaging in an outside activity. I'm sure sometimes management might appreciate learning of those things. Go ahead. Some of these are almost borderline on the ridiculous. They're so obvious. Manager calls a county on an adult child's behalf and explains what his or her position is, and the county better revise their... I mean, this is so obvious that it would be misconduct. You're using your position to get influence regarding your adult child's behalf. You cannot do that. If we look at PUB 228, misuse of position and or resources. Here you're misusing your position. You're basically sort of saying, hey, look, I work for social services. You better give me some info. You're basically saying that you work for social services to get something, and that is prohibited. You can look at 4 and 5 and you'll see that. Same thing with the first one. The first one is so obvious. LPA uses position to get licensee. Hey, can I borrow your van? They're at a facility. You're telling the licensee that you need to move because you lost your lease on your house. Oh, I got a big 3/4 ton van. Do you want to borrow? Oh, that'd be so nice. That would be seen as something grossly incompatible. You don't get to borrow a licensee's vehicle. And even if you didn't ask and they offered it, you wouldn't want to take them up on that. Now, again, we're coming back to my favorite subject because this always seems to be the one that comes up often, is using state time facilities and equipment for private intervention. Here's some examples. These are all things that have happened, and there's so much more. Using cell phone to sell wine, using state employer to do transcribing for independent legal service, using the internet for an outside business during working hours. These are all things that have occurred. Now, if we look at PUB 228 and we look at number 5, look at all these 1 through 9. No employee shall use the copy machine or computer equipment for home or personal use. No employee shall takers. Basically, don't steal stuff. Ranging employment outside of state while on duty. We already talked a little bit about that. Using your department status to solicit or to get stuff. We just talked about that. Using confidential info that you receive from work. We already talked about that. Providing services or information to prospective bidders on a contract. You're not going to get into much of that. Mailing lists, giving people names of providers. That would be something that you would not want to do. So if we look at this, let's do some very close to home examples. Let's say that you're an OT or an OA, and you notice that there's an LPA who is using an empty cubicle each week to display Avon. And Cookie Lee, too. And this seems to go on all day long. Not only is it disturbing and disruptive, but it seems to be inappropriate to you. Well, it is. You don't get to use state time and equipment to sell Cookie Lee, Avon, Amway, any of that stuff. Tamales even, I've seen people sell during working hours. I mean, it is endless, the type of things that go on at work where people are trying to sell things to make a little bit of money. Nothing wrong with making a little bit of money, but it goes right to the heart of what we've been talking about, which is using your state time and equipment for your own private gain. Now someone might say, well, but Mr. Burton, I was on my break when I sold that cookie lay, and that doesn't count because I could do whatever I want on my break. Well, does that mean you get to use a cubicle to display your stuff on your break? No. You can go out in the parking lot and get sell your Avon, but you certainly don't get to do it at your desk, at somebody else's desk, in the coffee room. Maybe in the cafeteria you can display a few things at your desk while you're eating lunch if someone wants to look at your cookie lay or whatever it is, but you certainly don't get to do it during working hours. And if you do, that takes a risk for you. Now, some people might say, well, I see people leaving things in the coffee area that says my son's engaged in baseball, Little League, and he's selling Cub Scout cookies. And if you want to put a buck in the box, you get some cookies. I would say that that's not something that you should do, or that it should be condoned. I will say sometimes that management does look the other way on some of these things, but it's not behavior that should be engaged in or condoned. Now, let's talk a little bit about processing. PS 413. So there's probably a lot of you sitting there saying, I guess I'm engaging in an outside activity and never told anybody. I'm going to get in big fat trouble because of what Mr. Burton just said. Well, let's look at PS 413. If you are engaging in an outside activity, each year you're supposed to fill this out. Now, on January 30th of this year, Chief of Payroll and Support Bureau Linda Nesbeth sent an all-staff email, and it was called, on the subject, Annual Form Reminders. This goes out to all employees every year. And one of the things that this says, if you go back into your email system, unless you deleted it, it says, in relation to what we're talking about right now, PS 413, as a California Department of Social Service employee, before you accept outside paid or, remember this, non-paid employment, or participate in an outside activity. Now remember what we talked about earlier, folks. An outside activity could be considered a service, giving free food to the downtrodden. That is an outside activity because you're engaging in a service for somebody else. Read the Incompatible Activity PUB 228 to determine if your outside activity needs to be completed. If the outside activity certification is required, the outside employment activity cannot start until approval is received. So what this annual reminder tells us, all of us, no matter what part of the agency that you work in, if you want to engage in an outside activity, you better fill this form out before you do it, because if you don't, you're violating departmental policy. Now some of you may be engaging in all kinds of volunteer work and you're going, oh no, I never filled out the form. Well, now's your time to get good with the rules and fill out the form. Now it says on our annual reminder that I'm looking at again, which was sent to everybody at the Department of Services on January 30th, 2013 at 10:08 a.m. A PS 413 should be completed and or renewed. Remember the word renewed. Number 1, when an employee first starts with the department. Number 2, which is the second bullet, when an employee has a status change, starts, stops, or changes outside employment / activities. Or, last but not least, every 3 years for an approved outside employment activity. That means if you were approved 4 years ago to be a real estate agent, uh-oh, the 3-year mark came, you were supposed to fill out this form because management still wants to know what you're doing. So every 3 years, even if you received approval in the first place, you got to fill out the form, and you're saying, oh, that's not fair. I already got approval. So it says here every 3 years you got to fill out a new one. So we've got these 3 examples of when this has to happen. Now, there'll be some questions. What if it's an emergency and my teacher at my kid's school says that they need help for a field trip? And according to Mr. Burton, that's a service I'm providing to somebody else. So it sounds like I have to fill out this form. How am I supposed to fill out that form, get it to personnel, have legal approved, have the deputy director approved when this is supposed to happen in 2 days? Well, talk to your manager. Sometimes these outside activities can be approved on an as-needed basis before you get approval on the form. In other words, temporary approval. So it's not the end of the world that something needs to happen real quick. You just have to work with your manager. Now, I want to go over the form itself, the PS 413. Many employees have gotten themselves in a lot of trouble because they weren't honest on the form. Let's say that you are trying to make a little extra money, and on the weekends you work at Applebee's, and you're an LPA, for example. It has nothing to do with your work, and you don't think you have to tell. Well, au contraire. Remember when we first started off today, when we were looking at PUB 228, it says anytime you're engaging in outside activity, even if it's working at Applebee's, you got to tell. And if we look at this form and we try to figure out, well, how do I complete this form? I hate forms. Okay, we look at the employee information. You put your name, put where you work, the mail station, and then we look at the categories. You think to yourself, my Applebee's work has nothing to do with work, so I'm checking box A and I'm going to be done with this form. If you do that, you'll have dishonestly completed this form and possibly be subject to do a disciplinary action. Because if we look at this form, it's all very clear. It's nothing in here, in my opinion, is confusing. If we look at category A, it says, I have no outside activity and or employment. If you're working at Applebee's and it has nothing to do with your work, should you check mark box A? No, you should not check box A, because that is an outside activity. What box should you check? Check box B. B says I have employment and or activities that don't deal with CDSS, such as cashier, retail, fast food, usher at a community event. In other words, yes, you are engaging in an outside activity, but it doesn't have anything to do with CDSS, so you check box B. The only time you are ever going to want to check box A is if you don't have anything going on outside of work, no outside activities. You're thinking to yourself, what if I am in the Sierra Club and I go on hikes? Remember I used that example? You'd be able to check box A, because that is not considered an outside activity. Why? Because you're not performing a service for anybody. You're just going on a hike. But if you're working somewhere, whether you get paid or not, even if you're volunteering at your kid's school, at your church, at a homeless shelter, at the little boys club, whatever, those are outside activities. You are performing a service, and you cannot check box A. You would check box B. It doesn't matter, again, I know I'm harping on this, about whether you got paid or not. Check box B says employment or activity. Remember the definition of activity, a service performed for another. So, what about category C? When do I have to check that? Well, if you're a real estate agent, you certainly do. Or if you have any type of outside activity that might be related to your work, directly or indirectly related. Daycare, foster care, group care, counseling. You're involved in, you're suing the department. So you want to look at these very carefully. If it happens that you think that you're sneaky and I'm going to have a daycare and I'm not telling anybody anything, and you didn't fill this form out, nor did you seek permission, that's going to be a real problem for you if one of your coworkers finds out about it and snitches on you, and management finds out, and then we're going to pull this form out, and someone's going to ask you about it. You're going to say, I didn't know I had to complete this form. And then someone's going to say, remember that webinar you had where that Burton guy was droning on and on about these forms? Well, that's not going to work for you. You are now on notice that you are to complete these forms when you have outside activities and complete them honestly. And don't try and say you didn't understand the form, because that's not going to work. This is all very simple stuff here. Now, what about your spouse? Category D, I have immediate family who may be financially impacted by my employment, participating in my official capacity, services, goods, state of California. You know, if you have a spouse that has a job that could be impacted by your employment by CDSS, that is when you are going to check those boxes. Your husband owns a care facility. Yes, you are going to check that box. So, if you're wanting to engage in an outside activity, this is the form that you're also going to fill out and provide to personnel. If we look down, it says, describe your duties to be performed. This would be your outside activity duties, or if it's your immediate family member. And then we go down, it says, check 1, the outside employment will not interfere with my duties, or it will. And then you sign your certification. And by the way, just because your supervisor signs this form doesn't mean that your activity necessarily is going to be approved. If you turn to the next page, if you're looking at it, the 2-page PS413, you'll see separate sections for legal approval, deputy director approval, human resources approval, and those are the things that are filled out by others. So the bottom line here is that not only do you have to fill this form out on a routine basis, but you have to fill it out honestly. Now, we've already talked about the process of this, of how it goes to the personnel unit and the legal unit. When it's in your intent to make some side money or engage in a volunteer work, how long the process takes depends on workload, but you certainly could be a squeaky wheel and send emails to personnel saying, what's going on with my outside activity request and what's taking so long? So, there also is an appeal process if you're turned down for these outside activities, and that's explained at the back end of PUB 228. Now, we've already talked about this window a lot, so I certainly don't need to waste your time going over it again. And I would print out the annual reminder that we already talked about that was sent out to all staff on January 30th. If you don't have that, I'm sure your manager could find a copy of that for you so you'll know. But this window really says it all, and we've already talked about it, so I won't repeat. But you will be expected to comply. Now, we're going to move on in a moment to this next window, which is the Public Contracts Code. But before I do, let's talk about some juicy examples of prohibited behavior. And a lot of this has actually come up. So, you probably have a copy of the prohibited behavior list, some of these things here. Now, we've already talked about some of these bullets, so I won't go into too much of them. First bullet we talked about, which is pretty much getting gifts, even water, from a licensee, token items. You take those at your own risk. We talked about the second one, which is getting into business relations with a licensee or an employee licensee. And we talked about selling Avon at work. You certainly don't want to ever sell Avon to a licensee. And you better not buy any junk from a licensee that they're selling. Same thing, back and forth both ways. Now we're looking at the third bullet, personal relationships with licensees. We already talked about that. Baby showers, Christmas parties, Halloween parties, weddings. Don't go to them. Don't invite them to your parties or functions. It's going to come out and it will be looked at as over-familiarity on your part, and it is actionable, so you don't want to get involved with the people that you're regulating. We already talked about the next bullet, which is asking and accepting for loans. And we already talked about the accessing of the computer equipment, copying and pasting electronic signatures. People are probably thinking, as LPAs. What's he talking about? You always have to have fresh signatures on your forms. You cannot ever copy and paste a signature, even if a licensee told you it was okay or your manager said it was okay. Don't believe any of them. Don't do it. Next bullet, some of these prohibitions. LPAs are prohibited from saying they went to a facility when in fact they didn't. Duh. That seems obvious. Or an LPA does a drive-by and say they went inside or they looked in the window of the door and you're looking at the report that was submitted saying the house was clean, well kept, there was plenty of food, everyone seemed happy. But then management does quality assurance phone calls and find out you never even went in the place. Or it turns out you did go in, but you were really only there for 15 minutes. But the report says you were there for 3 hours. And then someone's going to look at your mileage on your travel and see that you wrote on there that you traveled 413 miles. And if you're looking at MapQuest in your case, it looks like you could have only gone 200 miles. Management's going to wonder, okay, where's this LPA really going, number one, and number two, why are they saying they were at a facility for 3 hours when they were only there for 15? Well, maybe it's because you're at the mall or at the state fair or somewhere else where you're not supposed to be. All of that stuff falls right into PUB 228 regarding misuse of state time, etc., which we've already talked about. These are all things that have actually happened. Also, if you're at a facility, especially ones where an applicant is trying to get a license to run a facility, but you've not recorded the visit, that's a no-no. Anytime you set foot at a visit, you've got to record it. That may have happened in the past where LPAs went out to a facility that was trying to be licensed, and it just so happened they actually got some money, gifts from the licensee to speed the process along, and maybe that's why the visit was never put into FAS. Those are things that can get an LPA fired. Not worth it. So, if we turn the page and we see the top bullet about LPAs engaging in personal errands while on duty, well, you know, if you're on your way to a facility and you want to stop at McDonald's for some nuggets, that's all right. But it's far different if you're in Berkeley, for example, California, and you are inspecting facilities, but you want to get a hamburger at Marin Joe's in Santa Fe. Would it be okay for you to drive all the way over the Santa Fe Bridge, 58 miles to go get yourself a hamburger? No, that would not be okay. Those are far out from the incidental use that you might have while you're at work. So we've already talked about exaggerating your mileage and also exaggerating your gas bills. Sometimes we have seen gas bills come in for a car, $38 for gas, 16 gallons when the car only holds 12. Management might look at that and say, where are those gallons going? Maybe it went into a gas can in the trunk. Maybe it was siphoned out of the car. These are all things that can get a person fired. You do not want to engage in such vehicles, such behavior. Same thing with allowing your kid to drive your rent-a-car. Oh, I left the keys on the counter and I went upstairs to get dressed. Next thing you know, my son went to Macy's and he got pulled over and got a citation. I didn't know he had the car. That's not going to work as an excuse. As an LPA, it is your duty to take care of your equipment. Same thing with your laptop and cell phone. I didn't know my son must have been the one that put that porn on there and called all those 800 sex phone calls. I didn't do that. Sorry, but that's not going to work. Again, these are things that have actually happened and you're supposed to take care of your equipment. Same thing about leaving it on the front seat of your car and someone stole it. Not my fault. Well, those things do happen, but that doesn't mean that you won't get a talking to for leaving your equipment out when you're not supposed to. Also, we mentioned the fact that your son using a rental car to take care of it. Same thing with a cell phone. Do not let other people use your state cell phone. That is an incompatible activity. Now, the rest of what's on the second page of our do's and don'ts we've already talked about, so I'm not going to go into that. So we'll talk now about what's on your window here, which is the public contract code. Essentially, the bottom line is you do not get to benefit by using your influence in any type of public contract. When we started off today, I told you very rarely would this happen with a CCL employee. An example would be your husband owns a printing shop and you find out that your office wants to put some flyers together about how simple it is to get a license to own a facility, and you'd say, I know a printing facility that we could use. Okay, that would be a violation of you trying to benefit by steering the state towards a contract for somebody that you're related to. So we won't spend too much time about this, but if you read some of these and you're asking yourself, well, that doesn't include me, as an employee, you are considered a, quote, public official. That doesn't mean you have to be a deputy director, a supervisor, or manager. You're an employee, you're a public official. So here's some basic rules for conflicts of interest. A person has a conflict of interest for making and influencing a decision if they have an economic interest. You know, like when a licensee wants to give you a 2-pound box of See's candy, which might affect your decision to give them a citation. I didn't notice that they didn't have a fire extinguisher and there was that doughboy in the backyard. Me getting a 2-pound box of Bordeaux See's candy, that didn't affect my decision. I just didn't see that. Great example. Of course, you saw that and you'll get dealt with when those things happen. If you get gifts and then another LP comes in and looks at a facility and there's all kinds of evaluations, someone's going to wonder why you didn't see those. Same thing, public spouse or domestic partner would gain from the decision. They own a care facility and you're inspecting it. Ooh, that's a no-no. That's something that we've already talked about. Can't do that. Are you making a decision at work that might financially affect you? Again, we've already talked about this a lot, like getting gifts. That's something that may affect a decision whether to cite someone or not. That's why gifts are illegal. You don't get to take them. And or business relations, like selling real estate or Cookie-Lee or Avon or Amway, or a myriad of other things to licensees or licensee employees, because it might affect your decisions regarding your work. So to determine whether you've got a disqualifying conflict of interest under the Political Reform Act, are you a public official? If you're employed by the agency, yes, you are. Are you participating in making a decision or using your official position to influence a government decision? That's where we were talking about the printing example where there's a contract and you might be involved in it. Identify the public official's economic interest. Again, this rarely would apply to most of the employees in the Community Care Licensing Division. Here we're talking about Government Code 1090, more conflict of interest regarding using your official capacity in a board and or making purchases for the state, which really won't apply to you to a certain extent. And here we're talking about the Political Reform Act again, public officials making official position to influence a governmental decision which he knows has a financial, like not citing a licensee because you got a gift, or that you might get a gift in the future, etc. So again, keep this in mind when you're out engaging in your essential functions of your job. Basic rules. Employee cannot contract with the state. Employee cannot have a financial interest in the outcome of a state contract. Follow the money. We've already talked a lot about this. Prestige and influence of your job to get a private gain. That's where things are given to an LPA, whether it's a gift or money, and the idea being that you used your influence or prestige as an LPA. And someone might say that you're extorting these things from a licensee. Certainly when the licensee gets cited, that is when you're going to be advised by your manager that that's what's being claimed. And you're going to say, that's not true. are a number of questions that I'll go through. And some of these are interesting, and I think that you'll enjoy some of them. Okay, so let's go through some of these good questions. Number one, can an employee obtain state rates at hotels for personal use? Ooh, that's an interesting question. Is that what's left?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, you know, I think this is one that a person could struggle with. If you are out on state business and you've had to get a hotel for state business and you've gotten a state rate, but you want to stay one extra day and you've taken the day off so you can go hang out at Hermosa Beach. Now the hotel has told you, hey, we'll give you the state rate for the whole trip. And you're thinking to yourself, can I get away with that? Well, in that case,
Good. We're still recording.
Okay, in that case, that's probably okay because it's really in combination with your state work. And you're not necessarily soliciting it for the extra day that you want on your personal use. And sometimes a hotel won't necessarily even change the rate back to another rate. I'm sure if you asked them to charge you more, they probably would. Far different than if you were to not be on state business, but know that sometimes you can get state rates. And say, for example, you feel like taking a trip down to Riverside and you call the Mission Inn because you like the Christmas decorations. And say, well, can I get a state rate, but you're not there for any work? That is a problem. No, you cannot use your influence as a state employee to get a state rate when you're not there for work. So, I hope I answered that question. It all depends. Now, let's look at number two. Is volunteering at your child's school during non-business hours considered service that needs approval? Yep. Remember when we talked about an outside activity versus outside employment? An outside activity could be considered service that you're performing for someone else. So yes, that is something that needs to get approval. Same thing with the second part of this question. The same with religious volunteer work or sorority, fraternity that does community service projects. You know, again, I said when we started off on this that there are always lots of questions because people don't like, in my opinion, the definition, which is if you're performing a service, whether it's community service, religious volunteer work, that's a service and you got to get approval and you have to tell. I already talked about the other part here where what if you're asked at the last minute? You go to your supervisor and you try to get a preliminary approval. Question number three, does feeding the homeless at a church during the holidays need to be approved? Yes, it does. We've already covered this. So, the next one. What if your spouse owns a business that has nothing to do with your position as a state employee? I work for my husband when I'm not working for the state. Do I have to complete the Incompatible Activity form? What do you folks think the answer to this is? Yes! If we look at PS 413, it indicates clearly on the categories, I have employment that doesn't deal with DSS. So if you're working for your husband and it's a hobby shop, yes, you have to tell. It's right here on the form and we've already talked about this. So yeah, you will have to fill out the form, even though it has nothing to do. It is not a determining factor whether it has anything to do with the state as to whether you have to complete properly the PS 413. Of course, you have to fill out the right category, and that would be B. If it did have something to do with your work or the state, then you would probably use category C on the PS 413. Next question. Some LPAs do not have state-issued cell phones. What are the consequences if I need to use my personal phone and forget to block my number when calling out and inadvertently giving the facility my personal number? I would tell you that you should try not to do that. And the reason being is down the road, if you were to cite the facility, the facility might say that you were trying to solicit gifts and goods and you even gave them